On the 7th of November 1949, 74-year-old William Kent, known as Pop to his friends, was sitting having drinks with 3 people he'd met that day at the University Hotel in Melbourne, Australia. Pop had not met these 3 people before, but he appeared comfortable, even happy in their presence. The 3 people went back to his apartment for more drinks, but that was the last time that Pop Kent was seen alive. Hey there little berries and newberries, Berry here. Welcome if you are new, welcome back if you are not. Before exploring the Badger game case, I wish to thank both the subscribers, my little berries, and the channel members, the newberries. If you want to become a member of Berry True Crime, please click the join button below, the link above or in the description. It costs £2.99 per month, and for that you receive early access to videos and member only content. If you would still like the perks but don't want to give your money to YouTube, I have launched a Patreon, which I will put again a link above and below for you. If you don't want to do either of those things, that is fine, just watching is brilliant. If you want to hit the like, please do, or leave me a comment, and subscribing, which is free. The trigger warnings for this case are murder, torture, robbery, prostitution, deception and extortion, parental abandonment, life of crime, and capital punishment. This case is based on what I have researched online and within the public domain. Corrections are welcome with sources cited, and I wish to stress that there is no disrespect intended to anyone involved in this case. William George Kent, known as Pop to his friends, was born on the 23rd of October in 1874 in Victoria, Australia. Pop had grown up to be a jockey, as did his brother Jack, and after he retired he still remained very passionate and enthusiastic about horse racing. Pop Kent married Florence Anderson in around 1903 and they had 9 children together. The family moved around Victoria, Australia before settling in Melbourne. Whilst they had not officially divorced, Pop and Florence were living apart in 1944, and Pop became the landlord of a boarding house in Carlton, Melbourne, Australia, where he also lived. On the 7th of November 1949, at the age of 74, he crossed paths with 31-year-old Jean Lee, her boyfriend Robert Clayton, and his friend Norman Anthes. However, Jean told Pop that Robert was her brother, not her partner, and Norman Anthes was his friend. Norman Anthes was his real name, but he was going by Norman Andrews at this point, so occasionally I might slip between Andrews and Anthes. Apologies for that. They encountered one another at the University Hotel and enjoyed several drinks before Jean suggested they went back to Pop's apartment in Dorrit Street, which was around 6 o'clock that evening when the bar closed. Whilst they were at the bar, Pop had confided in Jean that whilst he had a legitimate business as a landlord at his boarding house, he also ran a side hustle as a SP bookmaker, which stands for starting prices, to do with horse racing. This was an illegal horse racing betting practice for which the SP stood for starting price, and when going to the bar to buy Jean, Robert and Norman some drinks, the 3 of them noticed that Pop had a roll of cash on him. Based on his illegal second job, Jean, Robert and Norman deduced that Pop Kent would therefore have a stash of cash at his home as well as on his person. It was illegal to be an SP bookmaker, and so he wouldn't be declaring this to the authorities, so he would need to keep cash at his premises rather than a bank. Right? Their plan was to have Jean Lee seduce Pop Kent and blackmail him into handing over any cash he had on his person or at home. This was a confidence trick, which is very similar to something called the Badger game, something that Jean, Robert and Norman had carried out a number of times before, and they'd seemingly got away with it. So why would this time be any different? Marjorie Jean Maud Wright was born on the 10th of December 1919 in a little town called Dubbo in New South Wales, Australia, which has since achieved city status. She was the youngest of 5 to Charles and Florence Wright, and her early life in Dubbo was mostly rural and rather outdoorsy. However, when Marjorie was around 7 years old, the Wrights moved from Dubbo to Sydney. Marjorie was a very smart student and had the potential to have a successful career in an office-type environment. She did very well in secretarial work at school, she got very good grades, but she didn't complete her studies and instead went straight into employment when she turned 16. As she did not take her final exams, thus not gaining her school certificate, Marjorie had very limited options when it came to employment. She job hopped, mostly working at restaurants and cafes and a factory to a mill, before she married 25-year-old painter Raymond Thomas, whom she'd known for several years. Marjorie gave birth to the couple's daughter a year after they married, but this was not a match made in heaven, and existence of being a wife wife and mother was not really what she wanted. Her husband was an alcoholic and money was tight, for Raymond's work was mostly with him being self-employed rather than a steady regular income consistently working for a firm. Raymond also received a 3-month suspended sentence for car theft, and after enlisting for service after the breakout of the Second World War, Marjorie left him. Marjorie took on the role of single mother, but providing for both her and her daughter was very difficult, so she placed her daughter in the care of her mother Florence so her daughter would be raised by her grandmother. Although she tried her hardest to make money legitimately moving from Sydney to Brisbane, it was very difficult for her. This was until she met a man called Maurice Diaz in 1943. Diaz was a petty criminal who had the gift of the gab and could charm anyone. The two moved around from Brisbane to Sydney to Adelaide to Perth. In Perth, they posed as a married couple by the name of Pierce. As a result, Marjorie was charged with using a false identity, as was Maurice Diaz, and he also received a conviction for vagrancy. Marjorie and Maurice's relationship was rather abusive and codependent. She was actually supporting them both financially when they moved back to Sydney from Perth because Marjorie was actually working as a prostitute, with Maurice being her pimp. It was then that she took on the name Jean Lee. She had many run-ins with the police while working as a prostitute, having received 23 court appearances over a 3-year period. After a brief stint in Tasmania, Jean Lee eventually left Maurice Diaz and she went back to Sydney and worked in a brothel and also as a barmaid. In 1946, through her work at the brothel, Jean Lee met a man called Robert Clayton. Robert Clayton was born on the 22nd of January in 1917 on the eastern suburb of Sydney called Paddington. After Clayton left school, he worked for Schweppes Limited before enlisting in the Royal Australian Air Forces at the start of the Second World War. However, he was often AWOL and insubordinate, so he was discharged a little over a year after joining the RAAF. But before he did actually join the RAAF, Clayton married a woman called Nancy Lewis. After being discharged from the Royal Australian Air Force, Clayton enlisted with the 2nd Australian Imperial Force and went to the Middle East, but not in combat, so he wasn't actually in a combat role, he was more in a service role. But Clayton wasn't in the Middle East for very long. He returned to Australia and found that while he was gone, Nancy had been having an affair. She wanted a divorce so she could be with her new partner, so this marriage ended. Clayton, though, didn't take this well, and he spent several months in hospital suffering a nervous breakdown. Whilst he did go into the 2nd Australian Imperial Force, just like he was with the RAAF, he was often AWOL and court-martialed, after which he was discharged from the SAIF. It was not long after this that he met Jean Lee. Clayton and Lee had a very passionate and somewhat tumultuous affair, and she described him as being the true love of her life, referring to him as my Bobby. They fit one another very well. They were both petty criminals and had no qualms about using and robbing people for their own gain. Robert Clayton was well known to the Sydney Central Criminal Court and received a number of theft and deception convictions. Like with Maurice Diaz, Clayton lived off Jean's earnings as a prostitute, but squandered a lot of the money on gambling. The couple did live with Jean Lee's mother, Florence, for a short while, but Clayton didn't like this arrangement. Whilst living with Jean's mother, it seemed that Clayton wasn't entirely happy with his relationship with Jean either. He and another man called Norman Bolger, we will just call him Bolger because there's another Norman in this story, so to avoid confusion, kidnapped and attempted to rape 2 teenage girls at a coastal village called Nora Head. Bolger was also known to Jean Lee, as well as another accomplice called Sylvia White, and the 4 of them together engaged in their careers as petty criminals. Whilst committing car theft, Clayton and Bolger were arrested for the assault on those 2 girls, for which they were incarcerated. During his stint in prison, Jean Lee continued to work as a prostitute and received several charges for this, including for offensive behaviour. She did find legitimate work as a waitress and also working as a carer for a paralysed American serviceman. That was until Robert Clayton was released from prison in September in 1949. This is where the couple began and regularly used the widely known as badger game, or ginger game as it was known in Australia, to blackmail and extort money from people. The way this scam worked was having Jean Lee lure a man into a compromising situation and having Robert Clayton interrupt them, posing as Jean Lee's husband. Robert would then threaten them, saying that he would expose the man's attempt at an affair, or if they had consummated it, to his wife, and if the man wasn't married, then it would be to his work colleagues or his family. If things didn't go their way during these scams, Robert Clayton was often violent to Jean Lee, taking his frustration out on her. The couple moved from Sydney to Melbourne shortly after Robert Clayton's release, and they met up with a fellow inmate of Robert's called Norman Anthes, who went by Norman Andrews. Norman Anthes was born on the 29th of May in 1910, and he had a lot in common with his fellow conspirators. He'd not been able to hold down a job very well. He had married and then enlisted in the 2nd Australian Imperial Force, during which he was court-martialed and discharged, and then when he came home, he found out his wife was having an affair. He'd had a number of convictions and stints in prison, which is where he met Robert Clayton. He'd also spent some time in New Zealand while he was deployed, but he deserted, so therefore he was deported back to Sydney. Norman Anthes was also convicted of numerous accounts of assault and housebreaking, so his crime was a bit more violent than the other two at this point. In Melbourne, the three continued to work as confidence tricksters and became well known to the Melbourne police. It was on the 7th of November 1949, so just 2 months after Clayton was released from prison, that he, Jean and Norman encountered William Pop Kent. After Pop Kent took Jean, Robert and Norman back to his apartment, which was in the same building as the boarding house, they opened a bottle of wine, they sat on the beds and the chairs and just were generally enjoying a drink together. But Jean started to get quite flirtatious with Pop and eventually went over to sit on his lap. One of Pop's tenants actually visited him and saw that Jean was sitting on his lap. They weren't there very long, but it was enough to see what this scene looked like. They saw they were all enjoying a bottle of wine, so they didn't think anything of it. As the evening progressed, Norman and Robert left the room, so the only ones in that room were Pop Kent and Jean Lee. She knew that the roll of money that he had on his person was in his fob pocket, and she attempted to extract it. To do this surreptitiously, she seduced him. She performed oral sex on him and tried to extract the money, but she just couldn't. When Norman and Robert went back, Jean Lee went outside and Clayton followed her. She told him that she just couldn't extract the money, so they tried one more time. Norman and Robert left one more time, leaving Jean with Pop. Once again, she tried to seduce him, but at this occasion, Pop didn't want it and he pushed her away. At this, Jean grabbed a bottle of wine and smashed it over Pop's head, then taking the leg of a chair that had been broken earlier that evening and started beating him with it. When Robert and Norman returned, they joined in the assault. They tore a strip from the bedsheet and tied Pop's hands with it and used a shoelace to tie his thumbs. They did manage to extract the wad of money from his fob pocket, but they were convinced there was much more hidden around the apartment. They ransacked the apartment, they looked everywhere they could to find more money and they couldn't find any. They demanded that Pop divulge the location of wherever he'd stashed any hidden cash, but he said he didn't have any. This was not good enough for the three. So they beat him and kicked him, they burnt him and slashed him with knives. Pop Kent begged them to stop. He begged them for mercy and protested that he had no other money in the place. Pop was bleeding and convulsing on the floor. However, this torturous scene did not go unwitnessed. A lady called Mary McWilliam, who lived across the street from Pop, would often go over and have a drink with him of a night, and this was no different. She went over and knocked on his door, but she was greeted by Norman Anthes. He went outside to speak with her and told Mary that he and 2 other people were having a private party with Pop. She was suspicious, but Norman Anthes was able to send Mary away. Whilst Norman was out of the room talking to Mary, Robert Clayton had stepped up the torture against Pop and began to strangle him with his bare hands, choking the old man to death. Another neighbour, May Howard, who lived in the same boarding house, could hear things going on and conversation, but then it abruptly stopped, and this made her very suspicious, so she went over. There was no answer when she knocked on the door, so she tried the handle, but it was locked. May then went round the house to look into a window, and she could see that there were 3 people in there, which were Jean, Robert and Norman. May stayed outside, kept a distance and kept her eye on the apartment. The trio left at around 9 p.m, and to avert suspicion, Robert Clayton called out goodbyes to Pop, even though Pop Kent couldn't reply as he was unfortunately dead by this point. May Howard waited for the coast to be clear before she went to go and see another neighbour called Bill Simons. Bill went over to Pop's apartment, and when he couldn't get in and couldn't get any sound from inside, they called the police. When the police arrived, they found Pop Kent's lifeless body under a bloodied sheet, and it was obvious this was not an accident. He had been brutally assaulted and murdered. Knowing that they had to get out of Melbourne very soon, Clayton booked flights from there to Adelaide for 7 a.m. the following morning. The 3 of them went back to the hotel where they'd been staying, the Great Southern Hotel and Spencer Street and got changed. Robert and Lee had a room together and Norman had his own room. After sharing a bottle of sherry together, they went to the TAA office to pay for the flights that Robert had booked over the phone. They then went on to the Copacabana nightclub where they continued their drinking binge. The neighbours gave descriptions of the three people in Pop's apartment, and they also spoke with people at the University Hotel. They followed a trail of witnesses all over the city before finally going to the Great Southern Hotel in the early hours of the morning of the 8th of November 1949. The staff at the hotel said that the descriptions of the three people they were looking for fit the bill of three people who had been staying there. At this point at 3 a.m, the trio had returned to the hotel, but then had gone out again. With the three people gone, the police searched their rooms and found the blood-stained clothing as well as other incriminating evidence. When they finally did return to the hotel, extremely drunk, they were arrested for Pop's murder and questioned separately by the police at the station. At first, the police struggled to get a confession or anything out of the three suspects, but they soon began to tell. But it was clear that self-preservation was at the top of their list of priorities, for each one blamed the other two for the murder. The police took a statement from Robert Clayton and showed it to Jean Lee and Norman Anthes and used that to extract confessions from those two. Jean Lee actually then admitted to the murder, but subsequently backtracked, saying she only admitted to it to get some peace and quiet. She admitted to hitting him over the head with a bottle and beating him. She then went back and said that she had no part in the murder and that it was all Robert and Norman. Whilst the three were held on remand, an inquest was held and it was concluded that William Pop Kent had died from, quote, asphyxia caused by compression and fracture of the larynx, willfully, feloniously, and maliciously caused by Jean Lee, 29, Robert David Clayton, 28, and Norman Andrews, 35, all of Walhara, Sydney. So the case went to trial. The trial began on the 20th of March 1950 in Melbourne. Because none of the three were accepting responsibility for the strangling of Pop Kent, it was unclear as to who had actually murdered him. However, because all three of them were there and committed horrific assaults on Pop and were all there for this reason, this constituted a crime of common purpose. Common purpose is defined as the following according to Wikipedia. The doctrine of common purpose, common design, joint enterprise, joint criminal enterprise, or parasitic accessory liability is a common law legal doctrine that imputes criminal liability to the participants in a criminal enterprise for all reasonable results from that enterprise. All three of them took the stand in their own defense, all claiming to have had nothing to do with the murder and that it was the other two. Jean Lee said that the blood on her clothing came from herself. She'd had a nosebleed that day. Clayton admitted to having made his statement of blaming Lee out of cowardice and to save himself, yet he somehow didn't think that it would get her and Norman in trouble, even though he blamed them. The trial lasted 6 days and deliberation was only 2.5 hours before all three were found guilty of murder. Jean Lee and Robert Clayton reacted very angrily and emotionally at the verdict and sentence, which at the time was death for murder. As was customary, the defendants were asked if they had anything to say as to why a sentence of death should not be passed. Robert Clayton said, quote, "What I could say would fill a book." He then turned to the jury and shouted abuse at them. Norman Anthes, he didn't give any reason why a death sentence shouldn't be passed. Lee was screaming, "I didn't do it, I didn't do it." The three were then asked to leave the courtroom and then taken to prison. They all appealed and said one of the reasons for appeal was that the way in which the police extracted the confessions was unlawful. The appeal was successful and the convictions of all three were quashed, and a retrial was ordered on the 19th of May 1950. However, the Crown then appealed the appeal because they said in spite of the fact that the police, yes, they didn't act lawfully, it did not change the evidence put to the court, nor did it prove that the convictions were unsafe. The convictions and sentences were therefore upheld, and although Jean Lee, Robert Clayton and Norman Anthes tried to appeal again, they were not successful. The death sentence was upheld and nothing could stop it. There was much support for Jean Lee from women's rights organisations, however their protests didn't do anything to stop the executions. Whilst in prison waiting her fate, Jean Lee had very violent mood swings, attacking her guards one minute and then being friendly the next. She continued to protest her innocence, saying she wasn't physically strong enough to have strangled Pop Kent. She further protested that the three of them never meant to kill him, saying it was accidental and not intentional. All three were executed on the 19th of February 1950 1951, with Jean Lee being executed at 8 a.m. that morning, and then the other two 2 hours later. Jean Lee actually fainted when she saw the gallows and had to be carried there. Her death warrant was read to her despite the fact that she was unconscious. She was placed on a chair, her head was lolling as she had the hood and noose placed on her before she was hanged. That is the end of this case. This is the killing of William Pop Kent. I couldn't find out a lot more about Pop, what he was like in life, but his gravestone said that he was a much loved husband and father, and he, 9 children. He had a large family, and he made something of himself being a landlord. Any descendants of him today, I'm ever so sorry for your loss. I'm sorry for what happened to him. It sounds absolutely awful. I really hope wherever you are in the world, I wish you all the very best. Thank you for watching, my little berries. Bye bye.